Thanks. Okay, so I'd just like to introduce Dr. Tomianu, who's going to talk to you about Section 37 certificates and the impacts for the ANAO of the PGPA Act review recommendations. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone. As Lisa said, I'll discuss the ANAO's processes for engaging with entities on sensitive information in the context of the recent certificate issued by the Attorney-General under Section 37 of the Auditor-General Act. I'll leave some of the PGPA stuff more to Michael White, who'll touch on it on the way through, and of course we've also touched on it on the way through in some of the previous presentations. In a sense, for ANAO, there's not a lot to say formally at this stage because, of course, government's still considering its response to the recommendations, and like all of us, we're just waiting to see where we land with that. So, this was the first certificate issued under our Act by the Attorney-General, and it was issued on the 28th of October this year, and it applied to our public performance audit report of Defence's procurement of light protected mobility vehicles for the Army. This is known as the Hawkeye, and people may have seen pictures of these vehicles in the news. They look like a very sort of pumped up Volvo station wagon, but well, am I wrong? So, under Section 37 of the Act, the Auditor-General must not include particular information in a public report if the Attorney-General has issued a certificate stating that in his opinion, and it is a matter of opinion, the legislation is couched in those terms, stating that in his opinion, disclosure of the information would be contrary to the public interest for any of the reasons set out in the Act. And then the Act does list a number of reasons. I've just listed the more important, no, not more important, but I've listed a number of them. Some of them are quite complex and a bit arcane, and they relate to sort of ongoing litigation and stuff like that. But these are the ones that people are most likely to come across. And I've just put them up on the board there. Prejudice to security, defence or international relations of the Commonwealth, disclosure of deliberations or decisions of Cabinet or Cabinet committees, prejudice to Commonwealth-State relations, and unfair prejudice to the commercial interests of any body or person. So the certificate that the Auditor-General received in June related to prejudice to security, defence or international relations, and unfair prejudice to commercial interests. So this was the first certificate under the Act, and it led to the Auditor-General presenting a redacted report for tabling to the Parliament, but he also presented an unredacted complete report confidentially to ministers, the Prime Minister, who is at the Finance Minister, the responsible ministers, and there's a provision in the Act that enables him in these sorts of circumstances to provide a confidential report. So there is a full report out there. And of course, I'll just make the point that the redacted report, even though parts are required to be omitted from the public report, it still, of course, is informed by the information that is redacted, if I can put it that way. You can't unknow what you know. So this is, as an auditor, so both reports are fully informed by all the audit evidence that we collected. It's just that certain information cannot be presented publicly in the public report. So there's been a fair bit of public and parliamentary interest, as you'd expect in all of this. And in the course of the JCP's subsequent inquiry into the issuing of the certificate, which remains ongoing, and at the October Senate estimates hearings, Parliament's asked a range of questions, not only of us, but of the Attorney-General's Department, as you'd expect, Department of Defence. And they asked whether any entities had flagged potential applications for a certificate. The Auditor-General advised that there'd been 2 instances since June, and in both cases the entities had flagged the option of seeking a certificate at a relatively early stage in the audit process. Now, the auditor gave quite a considered response to the Parliament. He said that he was reluctant to sort of name the entities because, for a number of reasons, he said that he was not suggesting that they'd done anything wrong in raising or flagging Section 37 issues with us, and he was reluctant to provide names, as this may also affect our ability to maintain a positive working relationship with entities. It's certainly our view that good relationships in the audit context facilitate effective external audit and therefore serve the interests of the Parliament. Nonetheless, the Parliament did assert its prerogatives, and it did insist that the Auditor-General provide the names, and obviously he did so. But against this broader background and context, I just wanted to make the case to people, and we'll be doing this in various forums, but I'd just like to make the case that it's fairly unhelpful, I suppose, for entities to flag a potential application for a certificate of this sort at an early stage in the audit process, especially doing so before the relevant issues have been fully worked through with the ANAO. And in particular, I'd suggest that it is unhelpful to do so in respect to report preparation papers. Most people will know what they are. I'll just step through that briefly. So that's a little summary of the performance audit process. And as you'd know, report preparation papers are provided by ANAO to entities after the fieldwork phase of an audit, when documentation and evidence has been gathered and analysed by the office. And in those report preparation papers, we try to present the available audit evidence and our preliminary audit findings. We also float possible possible recommendations, as you'd know. So this information is provided to the audited entity for review and feedback, including to correct errors of fact and interpretation. It's also an opportunity for entities to provide additional information and context where necessary. So this is meant to be a transparent process, consistent with relevant auditing standards, principles of procedural fairness, and a no surprises approach. So to assist entities' proper understanding of the audit evidence we've collected, report preparation papers will generally therefore include more information than ultimately appears in the proposed audit report that's subsequently authorised for release by the Auditor-General under Section 19 of our Act. So it shouldn't surprise anybody that these papers may include sensitive information and or references to sensitive information to facilitate the audit engagement. So I'll give you an example. To help the audited entity understand where evidence came from, we may well say, here's a bit of a direct quote from Cabinet, decision of this date, etc. But we have protocols where that level of detail around Cabinet process doesn't actually appear in the final audit report, so that we preserve the confidentiality of the Cabinet process as far as it's possible to do so. So, as I say, it shouldn't surprise people that more information appears in report preparation papers than subsequently appears. So, the issue is people shouldn't get spooked at this stage that the ANAO is going to go and release all of their sensitive information. The trick is to engage meaningfully through the ANAO executive or audit engagement executive. I'm certainly available, Lisa is certainly available for engagement at this time. So, our position and our advice to people is if any concerns relating to the disclosure of sensitive information remain following receipt of the proposed Section 19 audit report, the most appropriate course of action is for the accountable authority to bring those concerns to the Auditor-General's attention so that he can consider them. And that could occur, for example, during the 28-day response period under the Section 19 provisions. As you know, the treatment of sensitive information arises pretty regularly in the context of audits, and the Auditor-General certainly welcomes and carefully reviews all entity advice on such matters, because he has to, under 37, also have regard and conduct his own consideration of the public interest, because 37 has two parts. It says the Auditor-General has an obligation to have regard to these things, and then it also says there's a mechanism for the Attorney-General to have regard to these things. So the Act provides that the Auditor-General must not include particular information in a public report if he is of the opinion that the disclosure would be contrary to the public interest for any of the reasons I discussed earlier. And in this context, what the Auditor-General values most is substantive advice from entities on the sensitivity of information and any risks relating to disclosure. So it's not very helpful to us if people just assert these things. It's much more helpful if we receive some sort of substantive advice so that he can factor it into his decision making in reaching and in forming an opinion. So, in summary, I'd just say don't be alarmed if sensitive information is included in things like report preparation papers. That's a normal and desirable part of the audit process. The process is designed to help the entity understand the evidence collected by ANAO. If there are sensitivities relating to particular information, work through the issues with the audit team and the responsible ANAO SES in the first instance. If sensitivities remain after the proposed report is provided under Section 19 of the Act, the accountable authority should bring any concerns to the Auditor-General's attention, and he will certainly consider whether disclosure of the information would be contrary to the public interest for any of the reasons set out in the Act. So that's just a run-through of sort of some of the road we've travelled through the year, our posture on these things, but I'm very happy to take any questions people may have on any of this. No? All right, okay. Look out for the JCPAA report. It should appear at some point. They've had two sets of hearings. I think they're sort of thinking through their own position on things. Their website certainly has all the submissions, and if people have an interest, some of that makes very interesting reading. I will now hand over to Michael White, our Senior Executive Director in the Performance Audit Group, who will discuss our audits of the annual performance statements. Okay.
Thank you, Tom, and good morning, everybody. A little bit of background and status, and I spoke once previously at a CFO forum, and my initial question was, why would I? I'm not seeing any CFOs in the work I'm doing in performance statements. But I have met one now, so I have to correct the record on that. The Department of Education has a CFO who takes responsibility in this area, and as I'll point out as we go through, probably would show you all a few points on why CFOs should be interested in this space. We're about to table our third audit of the performance statements and the implementation under the PGP Act and rule. We're looking this time at a range of departments of state, including the Department of Finance in terms of the management of the framework. In total, when we table this report, and we're expecting to table shortly in December, we will have covered 10 entities within the Commonwealth. We will have covered 7 departments of state, and we will have included 3 smaller entities. In all honesty, I think the results probably fairly described as mixed. In language that CFOs would understand, I would say that we've probably got ourselves in the space of 2 clean opinions out of 10. We'd probably have 2 or 3 no opinions out of the 10, and the rest are somewhere in the middle. Obviously, that's an interesting place to be, not something of a set of results that you would expect in financial statements these days, and obviously very early days in the process of performance statement auditing for the ANAO and for entities. It gives us a bit of a baseline for where we're at. The reason we looked at departments of state this time around is because as the PGPA Act has been implemented and now reviewed, there is, as Tom mentioned, more happening in this space, and the PGPA Act review has recommended that the Auditor General undertake, or that the Minister request the Auditor General undertake, a pilot program of audits in this area. Internally, we're looking at how we would implement that process, and from our perspective, the entities that we refer to as controls report entities in financial statement territory would be our focus. We're also looking at implementing a program of audits in smaller entities as we do each performance audit, and we're developing a methodology to do that as well. One of the key learnings that we've found in our work to date, and this is where I can draw a link to why CFOs should be interested, is that the setup of the framework commences with the corporate plans. Entities need to set up the foundations against which they will report in their performance statement through their corporate plan. Entities should avoid technical terms and jargon. It's an externally focused document, not an internally focused one. Entities should show quite clearly what they're going to do in terms of measuring their outcomes at year end. They should include targets and benchmarks, and they should focus on the quality of the measures rather than the quantity. The thing I think I would draw to the attention of CFOs is that a lot of entities that we're working with haven't put an end-to-end framework together. Having worked with a lot of the CFOs in this room over time, I know that there's an end-to-end framework with every CFO in every Commonwealth entity, but in performance statements the same thing isn't occurring. In addition, one of the key things in the introduction of the PGPA Act and with the introduction of performance statements was an aim to reduce the size of annual reports. The material in the performance statements is supposed to replace the information that's in annual reports. So when we're looking at what entities are doing and we're seeing performance statements just being added to annual reports, we're seeing the size and the expense and the cost to entities growing. That's not what's intended. CFOs would therefore be funding something that wasn't intended and is expensive and inefficient. Entities are also making it harder for themselves, and in a period where we're looking at reducing the timeframes for financial statement auditing, possibly the introduction of audits of performance statements, which would occur predominantly at the same time and end up in the same annual reports. We need to be finding efficiencies in entities and in processes so that we're not overburdening ourselves with things that we don't need to be doing. One of the other key learnings that we're finding as we're working through the performance statements with entities is that entities, in a lot of cases, have defaulted to what might be a simple construct for their performance statements at the end of the year without doing the work up front. We're seeing a lot of entities propose case studies in their corporate plan that might be measured in some way, focus on some aspect of a program, and possibly be done by somebody else later. When we get to the performance statements, what we're finding out is that entities don't know how to measure their case studies, they don't know what programs they're going to be looking at, and that they haven't actually implemented a process, as all of you would have done, in terms of planning your financial statements. For a case study to be useful for an entity, they need to be planned up front. They need to articulate an agreed objective early in the piece. They need to have a defined scope and parameters. They need to provide clear targets and benchmarks and have a clear methodology. That needs to be exactly the same as any other performance measure you would look for in a performance statement. A broad claim of a case study at year end that doesn't have any of that detail with it really leaves an entity in a position of having to do all the work at year end when a lot of your resources in entities is already consumed with your financial statements and your annual reports. If that material doesn't exist within a case study, it's possibly just useful as context. And that's a good thing if you want. There's nothing wrong with an entity including context in their performance statements, but relying on them for performance measures without that detail is not going to be something that we can assure from an auditing perspective. And I suppose it's another interesting point from a CFO perspective. In all the years I've done financial statement auditing, I've never seen a case study. I've never seen a single CFO see the need to do it. I'm pretty clear that most of you wouldn't think that that was a way to get through your financial statements. Another one of the key learnings, and I would have to point out that this is a strength in the framework, is that the framework gives people the opportunity to provide some analysis at year end within their performance statements to explain their outcomes. Most of this material is generally known in the agency, and most of the material is generally known outside of the agency and can be pulled together to explain how you've gone against results. Some entities will publish a result and say achieved or not achieved without analysis to explain that they really should have done better, or possibly they were hampered from completing what they needed to do by environmental influences, changes in the government, or something else which was outside of their direct control. So thinking a little bit more, a lot of the material that would explain why an entity has achieved what it's achieved and why an entity has done a good job for all the hard work and money that's spent is being missed. As I said earlier, the corporate plan as well as the performance statements are external facing documents. So these are an opportunity to explain to the reader the connection between the performance criteria and the results that have been achieved and the internal and external environmental influences that affected them, and how this has actually impacted the overall program's progress. These are the kind of things that the new framework is supposed to do, so it doesn't necessarily mean that you've failed if you don't achieve a previously predetermined benchmark or baseline, but explains why you didn't get there. And I should also say one of the things that we raised earlier when we did the KPIs work in this space is that we suggested to entities that they start introducing ranges rather than set hard and fast benchmarks. It makes it a much simpler explanation at year end as why you fell in the predetermined range than to actually achieve or not achieve something by a percentage point and then argue about whether you were successful or not. Looking forward, we will be doing the fourth in the series of the performance statements audits in the not too distant future, and that will be reflected in our annual audit work program. Government is yet to respond on whether or not the Minister will request us to do a pilot in this space, but irrespective of that, we have the powers, and the Auditor General has the power to continue to do performance statement audits the way that we're currently doing them under the performance audit banner. We're also, as I mentioned earlier, developing a methodology that we'll be implementing across the ANAO when we're doing a performance audit on a program within each of our audits. Obviously, that would be a cut-down approach on what you would see within a major performance statement audit, but it should, and the test will be, to get something that gives exactly the same answer, possibly bar overall completeness. We're also offering to assist any agencies who are working in the area of their corporate plans and performance statements. We have a range of people that have worked on our corporate plans audits, of which I think there were 3, and this will be the 3rd performance statement audit. If entities have questions, they should feel free to contact us. From my perspective, it would probably be a good idea for entities to focus in this space because the risk of government deciding that the Auditor General will move to a full program of audits of performance statements is becoming very real. Happy to take any questions. Okay, then pass back to Lisa to talk about the Performance Audit Group.
Okay, so we're just going to talk about performance audit insights in terms of the ANAO's somewhat still new publication that we're experimenting with around just sharing with you the insights that we get from the audits or the performance audits that we undertake, and trying to identify what we think are some key topics that seem to be sector-wide issues, but also sharing instances of good practice. And I think moving forward, we'd like to use the insights opportunity to share more instances of good practice and encourage you to talk with each other where you see us reporting on an agency that's got some good structures, good risk management, or good procurement practices in place. So over the last couple of quarters, we've published some insights on efficiency, was our most recent publication, performance statements, cyber security, and we're right now working on our next topic, which, subject to the Auditor General's approval, will be quality frameworks and the importance of those in all the different types of government business that are out there. So aside from those topics, which I'll go into in a second, it's good I think, to just share generally what else we're seeing when we're doing our performance audits. First of all, we are seeing improved practice around governance structures. So there's certainly more really solid governance structures out there. Those committees are have clarity of their purpose and clarity of their role in terms of risk management in the organisation. But we do think there's some areas that they can improve in terms of their visibility of the risk at all levels of the organisation. There should be a clear line of sight from enterprise risks right down to project level risks. And if the committee isn't adding value, we often see committees are set up to oversight a project or a new reform in an organisation, and over time the meetings kind of just peter out. If a committee's not adding value anymore, the organisation should be looking at why, whether there's still some residual risks that are there that need to be managed, and what might be the best way to do that. Governance structures are put in place essentially to provide assurance and risk management. So it's important, I think, for the organisations to be looking at what follow-up are these committees doing to enable assurance to be given. For example, whether performance is being measured, whether outcomes are being achieved, whether budgets are being managed, whether risks are being identified, and those really important critical risks are being actively managed, not just put on a risk register somewhere. We often get asked by the committees where we report back to Parliament, so what are the governance committees doing about it? So it's not just a matter of reporting to them, it's making sure that there's actions taken. The other area that we're seeing some improvement is risk management. There's certainly greater awareness of the importance of risk management in organisations and structures in place to deal with risk. But we are certainly seeing still some examples of risk management plans being developed but then left untouched through the rest of the sort of project cycle or program cycle. Good risk management means that risk becomes part of that day-to-day management, and that risk management plan is a live, active document. And we certainly look at how that risk management plan has been used and updated throughout the life of a project when we audit. And the last one is performance measurement. I won't go into that. I think Michael's just covered that off pretty thoroughly in terms of measures are usually there, but not always really giving a good, complete picture of performance against the objectives of the organisation or the project or program. The other things that we're seeing are the use of report preparation papers, and then Tom's already talked to this a little bit, but it's about using that stage of the audit to have a really solid, deep conversation with us about understanding why we've landed where we have, and us listening to you in terms of your concerns about the audit too. The use of data, there's lots and lots of data sets across government now, but we're not seeing it used consistently across government as an evidence base or as an indicator of performance. And record keeping and capturing lessons learned. We are seeing increasing examples of agencies really looking back at what went right and what went wrong in previous projects and programs, and applying that to new designs. But there's more, I think, examples where people can go and use that past experience and apply that, and making sure that those lessons learned are being used, and that every time you go to produce a new program, policy, project, that we're not starting from scratch again. The other area is key performance measures. Really should be clearly linked to the stated program purpose and comprehensive enough to measure all aspects of that purpose. Keeping them up to date, we see KPIs developed but not being updated over time to reflect changes in circumstances or the environment. The other thing in audits is when you're agreeing to a recommendation, you agree to actually implement the recommendation. Parliamentary committees are increasingly asking us all the time, have they followed up or have they implemented that recommendation? We generally don't know unless we go in and do a follow-up audit. So we are starting a new series of audits this financial year on implementation of recommendations and looking at how can we provide that extra layer of assurance for parliamentary committees that you have implemented the recommendations that the organisations agreed to. Lessons learnt from audits apply equally to lessons learnt from past program implementation experience. We've talked a little bit about that. But good record keeping helps capture those past lessons learnt, so I just can't emphasise it enough. It's not just so that when the auditors come in you can provide evidence, it's so that you reduce that incidence of reinventing the wheel. Quality, you'll hear more about that in our next Insights products. Hopefully you've also heard a bit about it from Jane today as well. But we're seeing that quality frameworks are increasing in their use. They're playing an important role in many aspects of government business, ensuring accuracy, reliability, consistency, informing the design of automated processes, because a lot of our processes are increasingly automated, and they're being used to identify further areas of improvement. But we're sometimes seeing that quality frameworks aren't fit for purpose. So organisations try to have one quality framework. It works for more customer-facing areas, but it's not working for other, say, perhaps policy or program areas. So they've got to be fit for purpose. The other instance, lots of instances, I think, over the quarter of where there's been good practice, but also practice that could be improved. But one that I will share, because we've done quite a few GBE audits recently, is in the GBE space. GBEs are a commercial entity, obviously. They're established in most cases to generate a profit, but they're still spending taxpayer funds. And so we'd still like to see policies and processes in place in those GBEs that recognise that it's taxpayers' funds that they're investing and spending. Often they're quite small and they're starting from greenfields when we set up a new GBE. So I think there's lots we can do to assist those new entities to replicate the work that's already been done in other government agencies that are similar, so that they're maximising value for money, they're meeting those transparency needs, and they've got good policies and processes in place that they don't have to invent themselves. So back to our last efficiency publication, which was around assessing efficiency. We've provided a basic list in that insight for developing efficiency measures. So that was around identify the efficiency measures at either the entity or the subject matter level, compare the measures against suitable comparators or establish benchmarks, and then analyse the results of the comparison. So there's no point having a measure unless you're sort of going to follow it through. Efficiency essentially is a measure of comparison of inputs to outputs or inputs to outcomes. So looking at the resource used to produce an output, such as the cost of undertaking a procurement or the cost of providing a grant payment, the cost of undertaking a regulatory review or the cost of processing a payment. All of those types of things we seem to kind of measure okay. It's where it strays more into the policy space that we're finding measuring efficiency is more difficult. We often hear that there's no exact benchmark comparator, so we can't benchmark ourselves. But the benchmark doesn't need to be an exact comparator. If you know what the differences are between the benchmark you're using and yourselves and you measure it over time, you can still use that as an efficiency benchmark. Clearly an important role for government, given our payments of efficiency dividend every year, and as CFOs, you obviously need to know where can I find those efficiencies when I need to each year. So what measures are you using to help you know where the pockets of inefficiency are in your organisation? Given the general lack of efficiency measures that we see across government, if you think you've got a really good set of efficiency measures, I'd encourage you to share it with your CFO colleagues. I think some organisations are struggling still a little bit to measure efficiency, and so it's a good point of just starting a conversation within your organisation or with others about how do we measure efficiency and what's going to work for you. Cyber resilience was the other insight topic that we did in Q4 for last financial year. And in that particular insight, we gave a report on really what we thought or what we looked for as an organisation that had good cyber resilience in place. And we gave a list of suggestions as to things that you could sort of benchmark yourselves against. The first one was around governance and risk management. So establishing a business model and an ICT governance that incorporates ICT security into the strategy and planning and delivery of services. Managing cyber risks systematically, including through assessments of the effectiveness of controls and security awareness training. Tasking enterprise-wide governance arrangements to have awareness of cyber vulnerabilities and threats. And adopting a risk-based approach to prioritise improvements to cybersecurity to ensure higher vulnerabilities are addressed. They sound pretty basic, but it's interesting to the extent to which cyber is not incorporated into enterprise-level governance. The next one was roles and responsibilities and being clear about who has those roles and responsibilities for cybersecurity. So assigning information security roles to relevant staff and communicating their responsibilities clearly. Developing the capabilities of ICT operational staff to ensure they understand the vulnerabilities and the cyber threats to the system. Ensuring management understand their roles and responsibilities to enhance security initiatives and really making it part of the culture of the organisation. And embedding security awareness as part of the enterprise culture, including expected behaviours in the event of a cyber incident. Assigning data ownership to key business areas, including the role to classify the data and grant and revoke access to shared data by other entities. The third area was technical support, which is developing and implementing an integrated and documented architecture for data systems and security controls. Identifying and analysing security risks to the information system. Establishing a cyber incident response plan. And then the fourth area was monitoring compliance, which includes developing an approach to verify the accuracy of self-assessments of compliance. Sometimes we see agencies assess themselves as being quite robust in terms of their cyber resilience, but when we went in and investigated and did our audit, we found that what we assessed was actually quite different. So looking at the quality, I guess, of those self-assessments. The most recent cyber resilience audit also found that low levels of compliance were driven by entities not adopting a risk-based approach to prioritising improvements to cyber security and cyber investments being focused on short-term operational needs rather than long-term security objectives and building the quality of that system. So I'm going to stop there. We've reached our 12 o'clock mark. Has anyone got any last-minute questions before we wrap up?
Lisa, on that last one, did you do any checking against the Australian Cyber Security Centre of the three basics, password, whitelisting and patch application? And
Yep.
if you did, how was the compliance? And secondly, are there any consistent themes you see coming out of this in terms of failings or areas for opportunities for improvement?
Yeah, so I think we're seeing a mixed bag. So yes, we did check those things, and we certainly looked at the 4 mandatory and then the essential 8. And we found relatively good compliance, I think, with the 4 in some agencies. So the bigger agencies tended to have better controls in place. They had bigger IT investment budgets and more knowledge around those cyber security risks. The smaller agencies, on average, tended to have lesser controls, and so we've sort of made recommendations. So it was a bit of a mixed bag. On the remaining 4, there were certainly relatively low levels of compliance. They're not mandatory, but in terms of having good systems in place, it was relatively low. Any other questions? Okay, well, we'll wrap up. Thank you very much for spending 2 hours of your busy day with us. And if you've got any questions following that, please feel free to get in contact with any of us, and we look forward to engaging with you next time.